Cal Brennan hadn't cried in 6 years. Not since they put his wife and his son in the ground on the same afternoon. He had locked that part of himself away so deep he figured it was gone for good. Then he heard it. A sound coming up from the ravine. Faint. Broken. Something between a cry and a prayer. He almost kept walking. He almost didn't look down. If you've ever had a moment that split your life in two, before and after, stay with me. Subscribe to our channel, drop your city in the comments, and let's ride. The sun was already mean by 8 in the morning. That was the thing about Wyoming summers that most people didn't understand until they lived through one. The heat didn't wait for noon. It came early, came hard, and it didn't apologize. The grassland shimmered. The air smelled like dry pine and baked earth. And Cal Brennan, 41 years old, and shaped like a man who'd been hammered into shape by hard living, was moving along the ridge above the ravine with a mule named Sergeant, and the kind of silence that only men alone in the wilderness could carry comfortably. He wasn't looking for anything. That was the truth of it. Cal Brennan hadn't been looking for anything in 6 years. He woke up, he worked, he ate what needed eating and fixed what needed fixing. And when the sun went down, he sat on his porch and listened to the creek, and didn't think too hard about the things that used to wait for him at the end of a long day. The things that used to have names. He heard it before he saw anything. A sound, low and ragged, barely carrying over the dry whisper of the wind through the grass. It stopped. Then it started again. And Cal had spent enough years in these mountains to know the difference between an animal in distress and a human being trying not to scream. He stopped walking. Sergeant stopped beside him without being told. Cal moved to the edge of the ravine and looked down. She was maybe 15 feet below the lip, caught against a cluster of boulders that had stopped her fall. A woman. He could see that much from where he stood. Dark hair plastered against her face. One arm braced against the rock. The other pressed hard against her side. No, not her side. Lower. Against the swell of her stomach. And even from that distance, in that heat, Cal Brennan understood with a cold and absolute certainty exactly what he was looking at. She was pregnant. Far along. And she was alive, but barely. He didn't debate it. That was the thing about Cal that nobody who'd met him in the last 6 years would have believed. When something needed doing, he did it fast. Whatever had died in him when he lost Margaret, it wasn't that. He found the rocky path down along the ravine wall, half sliding the last few feet, and he was beside her in under 2 minutes. She heard him coming and tried to pull away. That was the first thing that told him something beyond a simple fall had put her here. "Don't." Her voice was wrecked, dry and cracked, but there was iron in it. "Don't you touch me." Easy. Cal kept his hands visible. He crouched down a few feet away from her, the way you would with a cornered animal. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Cal Brennan. I got a cabin about 2 miles northeast of here. I'm going to help you." She stared at him. Her eyes were dark brown, wide with pain, and they moved over him the way a woman's eyes moved when she was calculating exactly how much she had left to fight with. "You alone?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "How do I know that's true?" "You don't," Cal said. "But you've got a broken leg, and you're 7 months along in the July heat, and there ain't a soul within 10 miles of this ravine. So the way I see it, you don't have a lot of options right now." Something moved in her face. Not surrender, exactly. More like a person running the numbers and coming up short on every count. "Eleanor," she said finally. "Eleanor Hart." "All right, Mrs. Hart." Cal moved closer, slow and deliberate, giving her every second to change her mind. "Let me take a look at that leg." The leg was broken, clean through the lower bone from the angle of it, though he'd need to get her back to the cabin to know for certain how bad. She had a gash along her hairline that had bled a great deal and dried in the heat, and bruising along her left arm that told a story she hadn't shared yet. She was dehydrated. When Cal pressed his canteen into her hands, she drank in long, desperate pulls that made his chest ache in a way he hadn't expected. "Slow down," he said quietly. "Slow down now. You'll make yourself sick." She lowered the canteen. Her jaw was tight with the effort of holding herself together. "How long will it take to get to your cabin?" "Hour and a half, maybe, if Sergeant takes the level ground." He glanced at her stomach. Is the baby—" "She's still moving." Eleanor's hand pressed flat against the swell. A complicated expression crossed her face. Relief and grief tangled up together in a way Cal recognized without being able to name. "She's been moving all morning." "Good." Cal started cutting 2 straight branches from a nearby pine, working fast. "That's good." Eleanor watched him work in silence for a moment. Then, without preamble, "I had 2 others, before this one." Cal didn't stop what he was doing. He didn't look up. "I'm sorry," he said. "Daniel was 3. Clara was 18 months. Her voice was flat. Not because she didn't feel it. Cal had heard enough grief to know the difference between numb and controlled. This was controlled. Barely. Both of them went the same winter. Fever. "I'm sorry," he said again. He wasn't a man who reached for words easily, and he knew those 2 were not nearly enough. But he also knew that sometimes the best thing you could do for someone carrying that kind of weight was not try to lift it with language. She seemed to understand that. She didn't say anything more while he built the splint. When he moved to set it, he looked up and met her eyes. "This is going to hurt," he said. "A lot. You can scream if you need to." "I won't," Eleanor said. And she didn't. She gripped the rock beside her with her right hand until her knuckles went white, and her breath came out in long, controlled hisses through her teeth, and her eyes went somewhere far away. But she didn't make a sound. Cal worked as fast as he dared. When it was done, he sat back on his heels and let out a long breath he'd been holding. "You've done that before," Eleanor said. Her voice was strained but steady. "Set a bone." "More times than I'd like." He began wrapping the splint tight. "Ranching country. Injuries are part of the work." "Are you a doctor?" "No, ma'am. Just a man who's been too far from a real one too many times." A pause. Then, "My husband was sick for 2 years before he passed. Tuberculosis." She said it the way people said things they'd said too many times. Worn smooth, the sharpest edges rubbed off by repetition. "Toward the end, I learned a fair amount of medicine myself, out of necessity." Cal tied off the last of the wrapping and looked up at her. "When did he pass?" 4 months ago." She met his eyes. "March." March. Which meant she'd been managing that land, those animals, whatever was left after 2 years of sickness and the loss of 2 children. Alone. 7 months pregnant. In Wyoming. Cal didn't say any of what he thought about that. He simply said, "Can you put your arms around my neck?" Eleanor hesitated for only a second. Then she reached up, and Cal Brennan, who had not let himself hold anything fragile in 6 years, lifted Eleanor Hart as carefully as he'd ever done anything in his life, and started climbing. Sargent accepted the extra weight with the resigned dignity of a mule who had seen everything and judged none of it. Cal walked beside the animal with one hand on Eleanor's back, steadying her against the rolling gait of the trail. She sat upright, spine straight, chin level, though the effort it cost her was visible in the line of her jaw and the white edges of her knuckles where she gripped the saddle horn. The heat pressed down on all three of them without mercy. "The men who work your land," Cal said after a while. "You have hired hands?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I did." He caught the past tense. "What happened to them?" "Rufus Holt happened to them." She said the name the way you said the name of a disease, quiet and specific. "He owns the Holt Cattle Company, 300,000 acres east of Clearwater. He's been after the Hart property since before Thomas was even sick." A pause. "After Thomas died, he came to the house with two of his men, said the property would naturally revert to Holt's existing land grant upon the death of the primary title holder, and that I'd do well to sign the papers and take the settlement. And you told him no." "I told him Thomas had registered the deed in both our names in 1879, which he knew perfectly well, and that the land belonged to my child and to me, and that he could take his settlement papers and his land grant and put them somewhere that would require a doctor to remove." Cal's mouth moved. It was almost a smile. "I reckon that went over well." "He was polite about it." Her voice dropped. "Rufus Holt is always polite. That's the thing about him. He smiles the whole time." A pause that had weight to it. 3 days later, my hired man Burke showed up at the door with a broken arm and a message that said I had 2 weeks to sign, or I'd have nothing left to sign for. Cal's hand tightened slightly where it rested against her back. "Did you go to the sheriff?" "Sheriff Dannon is Holt's cousin." She said it without emotion, just a fact she'd made her peace with. "I sent a letter to the land office in Cheyenne. I was waiting on a reply." She stopped. "Yesterday morning, 2 of Holt's men came to the cabin. I was alone. I ran." Another pause. Longer. "They caught me about a mile past the south pasture. They didn't touch me. Not the way you might think. They just took me to the ravine and told me that accidents happen to women who couldn't manage their emotions, and that the land would be settled properly once I was out of the way." The words settled into the heat like stones into water. Cal said nothing for a long moment. "And then they left you there," he said. "And then they left me there." The trail curved. The sun sat directly overhead now, vicious and indifferent. Cal reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat to give Eleanor more shade. "Nobody's going to find you at my cabin," he said. "Not without knowing where to look." "They'll come looking." Eleanor's voice was steady, but very quiet. "They know I'm alive, or they suspect it. A woman that far along doesn't just disappear quietly, not without somebody asking questions. They'll want to be certain." "Let them come," Cal said. She looked at him then, really looked at him, the way she hadn't allowed herself to do yet, openly, measuring. "You don't know these men, Mr. Brennan." "No," he agreed, "but I know men like them." "That's not the same thing." "No," he said again, "it's not." He meant it as a reassurance. She didn't seem entirely convinced. But she didn't argue further, and they walked on through the blazing Wyoming morning in a silence that, for the first time, felt like something other than 2 strangers enduring the same stretch of bad road. The cabin sat in a stand of spruce at the base of a long slope, with a creek running along the south side and a view of the mountains that, under different circumstances, might have been called beautiful. It was solid. That was the word that came to Eleanor's mind when she saw it. Not large, not refined, but solid in the way that things built by a single pair of careful hands over many years were solid. Like it had grown there. Cal lifted her down from Sergeant and carried her inside before she could protest, setting her on the narrow bed against the wall with a gentleness that felt oddly formal, like something he was being very deliberate about. "There's water in the pitcher on the table," he said, straightening. "I'll get a fire going and heat more. Are you hungry?" "Yes." Then, almost reluctant, "Thank you." He moved to the fireplace. Eleanor looked around the cabin. It was clean, not the clean of a man who cleaned because someone expected it, but the particular clean of a person who had learned that keeping a small space ordered was a way of keeping their mind ordered. There wasn't much: a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of tools and medical supplies along one wall, a row of hooks near the door for coats and gear, one window, a Bible on the mantel, and one other thing. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment. A woman's shawl, folded carefully over the back of the second chair. Pale blue wool, worn at the edges. Old enough to be fragile, kept too carefully to be anything but deliberate. She looked away before Cal turned back around. "You've been out here a long time," she said. 6 years. He set a pot over the fire and straightened. "Before that, I had land down in the valley. Cattle. A house worth living in." A pause. "My wife, Margaret. She was—" He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked. "She died in childbirth. The boy didn't make it either." The room was very quiet. Only the creak outside and the beginning crackle of the fire. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. "So am I." He said it simply, without self-pity, just a fact he'd lived with long enough to carry without bending. "I sold the land, came up here. Figured I'd stay long enough to get my feet under me." "That was 6 years ago." "Yes, ma'am." He met her eyes briefly. It was. Eleanor understood something then that she didn't say aloud, that the distance of these mountains and the silence of this cabin and the careful folding of that blue shawl were not the signs of a man who had healed. They were the signs of a man who had found a place where not healing was manageable. She understood that more than she wanted to. "Mr. Brennan?" she said. "Cal." "Cal." She folded her hands over her stomach. "What I told you about Holt, about his men. I need you to understand that I'm not asking you to involve yourself in any of it. You've already done more than I had any right to expect." A pause. "If they come here looking, I don't want you in the middle of it. You have no obligation—" "Mrs. Hart." Cal said it quietly, but with a finality that stopped her. He looked at her steadily. "You're in my house. You're carrying a child. And there are men who left you for dead in a ravine." He picked up the water pitcher and poured a cup and set it on the table beside her. "That's about all the obligation I need." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "You're a stubborn man," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he agreed. "I've been told." He let her sleep in the afternoon. The exhaustion took her quickly, one moment sitting up against the wall, the next gone, her head tipped back and her breathing slow. He watched her for just a moment, the tight line of her mouth easing slightly in sleep, one hand still curved over the swell of her stomach, even unconscious, protective to the last. And then he went outside to see the sergeant and think. The mountains were quiet in the afternoon heat. A hawk turned lazy circles over the western ridge. The creek moved cold and clear over its stones. Cal leaned against the fence and thought about Rufus Holt. He didn't know the man personally, but the shape of him was familiar. The kind of man who built his world on the understanding that other people's loss was simply opportunity wearing a different hat. Cal had grown up knowing men like that, had watched them take land from families who'd worked it for a generation, had watched the law tip its hat and look the other way, because the law and the money were drinking from the same well. He thought about Margaret. He thought about how she had looked at him in the last hours, her hand in both of his, already going somewhere he couldn't follow. How she had said, "It's all right, Cal. You're going to be all right." She'd been wrong about that. but she'd meant it. He thought about the sound that had come up from the ravine that morning, and the fraction of a second in which he had stood on the ridge and almost kept walking. Inside the cabin, Eleanor Hart's child stirred under her mother's sleeping hand, alive and stubborn and 7 months into a world that hadn't given her any reason yet to arrive with hope. Cal pushed off the fence and went to check the perimeter. If Holt's men came, they wouldn't find him waiting on the porch. She woke in the early evening to the smell of something cooking and the low sound of Cal's voice. It took her a disoriented moment to realize he wasn't talking to her. She lay still and listened, and gradually she understood he was speaking to her stomach. She went absolutely still. "Don't know what your mom has told you about the world," Cal was saying, very low, from the other side of the room. "But I'll tell you this. She's the toughest person I've met in a long time. Maybe the toughest I've ever met." A pause. "You're going to be all right. Both of you. I don't make promises I can't keep, and I'm not making you one now. But I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you get the chance to find that out for yourself." Eleanor lay very still, with her eyes closed, and something pressing hard against the inside of her chest that had no safe name. When she heard him move back to the fire, she waited another minute and then shifted and said, "That smells good." "Rabbit stew," he said, without turning. "Not fancy." "I haven't had anything since yesterday morning." She pushed herself upright carefully. "It could be boot leather, and I wouldn't complain." He brought her a bowl and sat in the chair across from her while she ate. They didn't talk much, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the careful distance of two strangers, but something that had breathed itself into something else. Something that had no name yet, either. Outside, the last light died over the mountains, and somewhere south of them, in an office in Clearwater with his name on the door and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, Rufus Holt was counting the hours. Cal was up before the sun. He'd slept 2 hours, maybe 3, in the chair by the door with his rifle across his knees and one ear tuned to every sound the night made. The mountains had their own language after dark. The creek, the wind in the spruce, the occasional crack of a branch that meant deer and not men. He knew it well enough to sleep light and wake fast. Eleanor was still out when he built the morning fire. He moved quiet, the way a man moved when he'd spent years with no one to disturb. But somewhere around the time the coffee started, he heard the shift of her breathing that meant she was awake and trying to figure out where she was. "It's all right," he said, without turning. "You're still here." A pause, then, "I know where I am." Her voice was rough with sleep, but steady. "I just wasn't sure you were real." He poured a cup and brought it to her. She sat up slowly, one hand braced against the wall, the other automatically finding the curve of her stomach, the way a person reached for something they couldn't afford to lose. The bruising along her arm had deepened overnight into something ugly. He noticed it. He didn't say anything about it yet. "How's the leg?" he asked. "Hurts." She accepted the coffee with both hands. "Hurts less than yesterday." "That's something." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "You didn't sleep in the bed." "I don't, generally." "That's not what I meant." She held his gaze. "You were watching the door." Cal sat down across from her. "Yes, ma'am." "They might not come today." "They might not." He wrapped both hands around his own cup. "But men like Holt don't leave loose ends. They came out to that ravine to finish something, and they left before it was finished. That's going to bother somebody." He looked at her steadily. "So yeah, I was watching the door." Eleanor said nothing for a moment. She looked at the steam rising from her coffee. Something moved across her face. Not fear exactly, more like a woman recalibrating, adjusting the weight she was carrying to account for one more thing. "There were two of them," she said. "At the ravine, Deke Pruitt. He's Holt's foreman, been with him 15 years. The other one I didn't recognize. Young, blonde. Wouldn't look at me while they were doing it. Pruitt's the one to worry about," Cal said. "You know him?" "Know of him. He came through this territory about 3 years back. Had a dispute with a rancher named Alderman over grazing rights. Alderman ended up with a broken hand and a burned barn." A pause. "Nobody proved anything." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "That sounds about right." "The young one being uncomfortable doesn't make him less dangerous," Cal said. "Sometimes, the ones who can't look at what they're doing are worse, because they'll do it faster just to get it over with." She absorbed that, nodded once, the way a person nodded when they'd already suspected something and were just having it confirmed. "I need to get word to Cheyenne," she said. "The land office. If I can get a letter there before Holt does, before he has time to file something fraudulent. Thomas registered that deed legally. It's on record. But records have a way of disappearing when enough money changes hands. I know a man in Jackson's Post who rides courier to Cheyenne twice a month. Honest man. Name's Abel Crawford." Cal set down this cup. "Next drive is in 4 days." 4 days. She said it quietly, doing the math behind her eyes. "I can get the letter to him without coming into town myself. He'll take it and he won't ask questions." Cal leaned forward, elbows on knees. "But I need you to write it today, while you're thinking clear, while the details are sharp. Names, dates, the specific parcel numbers on that deed if you know them. Everything." "I know them." She said it without hesitation. "I've memorized everything about that property. Every boundary marker, every water right, every filing date." A pause. The ghost of something moved across her face. Pride, grief, stubbornness, all three at once. "Thomas used to say I was better with numbers than any lawyer he'd ever met." He was right to say it. She looked at Cal for a moment, and there was something searching in the look, like she was trying to figure out if he meant it or if he was simply a man who said kind things easily. He returned the look without blinking, and apparently whatever she found there satisfied her, because she nodded. "I'll need paper," she said. "Shelf behind you, top row." She twisted carefully and reached for it, and in the movement he caught a clear view of the bruising on her upper arm. The full shape of it now, in the morning light. 4 distinct marks, evenly spaced. Fingerprints. Someone's hand, gripped hard enough to leave that. Cal looked away. His jaw was doing something that he didn't entirely control. "Pruitt," Eleanor said quietly, settling back with the paper. She hadn't missed where his eyes had gone. "When they took me off my horse." The fire popped. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I'm going to check the perimeter," Cal said. "There's dried biscuit on the shelf and more coffee in the pot. I'll be back inside 20 minutes. He stood up and took his rifle off the hooks by the door with a motion so practiced it was barely a motion at all. His hand was on the door when Eleanor said his name. "Cal." He looked back. "Thank you," she said. Just that. But the way she said it, not like a courtesy, not like a formality, but like a woman who had gotten very careful with those 2 words over the years, and only spent them when she meant every syllable. Landed somewhere behind his sternum, and stayed there. He nodded once, and went outside. He found the tracks before he'd gone 100 yards from the cabin. 2 horses, shod recently, following the north trail to within maybe a quarter mile of the creek, and then stopping. The disturbed ground made it clear they'd stood there a while, probably last night, sometime after dark, and then turned back, looking, getting the lay of the land. They hadn't found the cabin. The tree cover was thick enough, and he'd built the place deliberately set back from any obvious trail. But they'd been close. Cal crouched over the tracks for a long moment, reading them the way he read everything. Methodically, without hurry, letting the information settle before he decided what it meant. It meant they'd moved faster than he'd expected. It meant Holt wasn't waiting on certainty. He was already in motion, already casting a wide net. And it meant that 4 days was a long time. He went back to the cabin at a pace that was not quite a run. Eleanor looked up when he came through the door. She read his face immediately. "How close?" she asked. "Quarter mile north, last night." He hung the rifle and came to the table. They turned back, but they'll widen the search. She was very still for a moment. Then she looked down at the paper in her hands, at the careful lines of her handwriting covering half the page. And she deliberately picked up the pencil and kept writing. Cal watched her. "You're not going to ask me what we do," he said. "I know what we do." She didn't look up. "We finish the letter, and we stay quiet, and we don't panic." A pause. "Panicking uses energy. I don't have extra energy to spare right now." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He sat down and started cleaning his rifle. And for a while the only sounds in the cabin were the scratch of Eleanor's pencil and the soft mechanical clicks of Cal's work. And outside, the summer heat building toward another brutal afternoon. They were halfway through that silence when Eleanor said, without looking up, "Tell me about Margaret." Cal's hands didn't stop moving, but something shifted in the quality of the stillness around him. "Why?" "Because you're easier to trust when I know something real about you." She kept writing. "And I need to trust you right now, more than I've needed to trust anyone in a long time." That was so plain and honest that it cut through every reflex he had toward deflection. He looked at the rifle in his hands for a long moment. "She was from Ohio originally," he said. "Came west with her family when she was 16. I met her at a cattle auction in Laramie, which she always said was the least romantic story she'd ever heard, and which she told everyone anyway because she thought it was funny." He paused. "She laughed a lot. Not the polite kind of laugh, the real kind. The kind that surprised her." Eleanor's pencil had slowed. "We had the ranch for 4 years before she got pregnant," he continued. "Everything was... it was good. It was really good. The kind of good that you don't have the sense to be grateful enough for while you're in it." He kept his eyes on the rifle. "The baby came early. She was already in trouble before I could get the doctor from town, and by the time he arrived..." He stopped. "She made it to the next morning, held on long enough to say what she needed to say." Another pause. The boy was gone before he ever drew breath. The room was very quiet. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. And like her thank you from earlier, it was not a courtesy. It was the real thing, said by a woman who knew exactly what she was sorry for. "I sold the land 30 days after the funeral," Cal said. "Came up here because up here nothing expected anything from me." He reassembled the rifle with his hands moving automatically. "Figured I'd stay a year, maybe 2. 6 years, Eleanor said softly. 6 years. She set down her pencil. When he finally looked up at her, she was watching him with an expression that was complicated and careful and entirely without pity. Which, he realized, was exactly what he'd never been able to tolerate from anyone. The pity. She didn't have any. She just looked at him like a person who recognized the particular shape of a wound because they'd dressed it on themselves every morning. "Thomas was sick from the 2nd year of our marriage," she said. "It started small, a cough, nothing alarming. By the 3rd year, he couldn't work a full day. By the 4th, she picked up the pencil again. By the 4th year, I was running the property myself and raising 2 small children, and trying to pretend at the dinner table every night that everything was going to be fine. She began writing again, and her hand was perfectly steady. Daniel and Clara got sick the same week. They were gone in 10 days. I was 3 months along with this one when it happened. Cal was watching her. Thomas died 4 months after them, she said. He knew about the baby. He was glad about the baby. He made me promise. Her hand stopped, just for a second. Then it moved again. He made me promise to fight for the land. Said it was the children's inheritance, whatever children we had left or were going to have, and that Rufus Holt was never going to take what Thomas Hart had built. She finished a line and moved to the next. So I promised. And then he was gone, and there was just me and this child, and a deed of property that every powerful man in the county wanted to take. She set the pencil down and looked up at him with that same clear, unsparing gaze. I am very tired, she said simply. I want you to know that. Not weak, just tired. The kind of tired that goes all the way down. I know that kind, Cal said. I know you do. She folded the letter carefully. That's why I told you. He crossed the room and took the letter when she held it out. He folded it once more, small, and put it inside his shirt. The gesture was automatic, certain. The gesture of a man who intended to see something through. If something happens to me, Eleanor started, nothing is going to happen to you. Cal, she said it quietly, but with a firmness that stopped him. If something happens to me, this child is named Hope. I decided that after Thomas died. I want you to know that. She held his gaze. And I want you to know that whatever happens, you don't owe me anything. You already gave me the hardest thing there is to give. What's that? You didn't keep walking. The knock on the door came 3 hours later. Not the aggressive pound of a man who expected to force his way in. 3 measured knocks, deliberate and calm. The calling card of someone who wanted to appear reasonable. Cal was on his feet and at the door before the 3rd knock fully faded. Eleanor already pressing herself flat against the back wall, her breathing controlled, her eyes on him. He put his hand on the door, but didn't open it. Who's there? My name is Tom Greer. A voice on the other side. Male, middle-aged, conversational, almost friendly. I'm looking for a woman by the name of Eleanor Hart. Her neighbors reported her missing, and there's some concern for her welfare, given her condition. Eleanor's eyes met Cal's across the room. The word neighbors was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Eleanor had described her nearest neighbor, old Hester Bowman, 3 miles east, as the one person in the county Holt would never have gotten to. Hester was 80 years old, half deaf, and had opinions about Rufus Holt that she expressed loudly and in public. Nobody had reported Eleanor missing to anyone. This man had been sent to find her. Cal opened the door 4 inches, keeping himself in the gap. The man outside was broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, wearing a vest that didn't belong on a working rancher. His horse stood behind him, and on that horse, just barely visible past the man's right shoulder, was a second rider, hanging back. Young, blonde, not quite meeting Cal's eyes. The hair on the back of Cal's neck stood up. No woman here, Cal said. Just me. I've been alone up here 3 years. Greer smiled. It was the kind of smile that was assembled rather than felt. Ah, well, I apologize for the trouble, but you understand, there's a pregnant woman unaccounted for, and folks are worried. His eyes moved, just once, to the space behind Cal's shoulder. Quick. Practiced. Would you mind if we— I would, Cal said. The smile stayed where it was. Sir, if you're harboring, I'm not harboring anything. Cal's voice was level, not loud, not threatening, just absolutely final. This is my land and my cabin, and you don't have a badge, and I don't know your name from Adam. So I'm going to ask you to turn your horses around and go back the way you came." A long pause. Greer looked at him. Cal looked back without blinking. Behind Greer, the blonde rider's hand moved toward his hip. "Don't," Cal said. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved. But something in the single word hit like a slap, and the blonde rider's hand went very still. Greer absorbed this for a moment. Then he tilted his hat. "My apologies for disturbing you." "No trouble," Cal said. He watched them all the way back up the trail, standing in the doorway, not moving, until the sound of their horses had gone completely. Then he stepped back inside and pushed the door closed. Eleanor was already upright, standing with her weight on her good leg and her spine straight and her hands folded tight in front of her. She had a look on her face that he would have needed a better vocabulary to describe. Not fear, not anger. Something older and harder than both. The look of a woman who had been hunted and had decided she was done being prey. "The blonde one," she said. "From the ravine." "Yes." Her voice was very quiet. "That was a message. He sent them here not to find me. He sent them here to let us know he knows where we are." Cal looked at her. "Then we need to not be here," he said. Eleanor held his gaze for one long moment. Something passed between them, the particular kind of understanding that only arrived when two people had run out of time to be careful with each other. "Jackson's Post," she said. "Jackson's Post," he agreed. Outside, somewhere on the North Trail, the sound of two horses had stopped moving, and in the heavy summer silence that followed, there was something that felt less like stillness and more like the moment before a held breath breaks. They moved fast. Cal didn't believe in packing light under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and he'd spent enough years in these mountains to know the difference between preparation and delay. He gave Eleanor 10 minutes and himself 5. What mattered was medicine, the letter, water, and ammunition. Everything else was just wait. Eleanor didn't argue with any of it. She sat on the edge of the bed, pulling her boots on, the left one loose over the splinted leg, with the focused efficiency of a woman who had learned to leave things behind. She didn't look around the cabin. She didn't linger on the blue shawl still folded over the chair. Cal did. He stood at the door with his rifle and his saddlebag, and he looked at that shawl for exactly 2 seconds. And then he crossed the room and tucked it into the bag without letting himself think about it. Eleanor saw him do it. She didn't say anything. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes." "The leg?" "I said yes, Cal." She stood, weight distributed carefully. Her jaw was tight, but her eyes were clear. "Let's go." He helped her onto Sergeant and took the lead line himself, moving on foot at a pace that was just below a jog. The North Trail was out. The South Trail added 40 minutes, but kept them out of the open ground where Greer and the blonde rider had come from. Cal had used the South Trail in every kind of weather for 6 years, and he knew every stone of it. That was the only advantage they had, and he intended to use it completely. They were 20 minutes out when Eleanor said, "Stop!" Cal stopped. "Listen," she said. He listened. Horses. More than 2. Coming from the east, which was not where Greer and the blonde rider had gone, which meant Holt hadn't sent 2 men to find them. He'd sent 2 men to flush them out. "Off the trail," Cal said. "Now." He pulled Sergeant into the tree cover with one hand and pressed flat against the nearest trunk with the other, scanning the trail behind them. Eleanor didn't ask questions. She pulled her skirt out of the way and flattened herself against Sergeant's neck, making them both as small as possible. And she held the horse steady with a firmness that Cal noted and filed away for later. 3 riders came down the trail at a canter. Deke Pruitt was the one in the middle. Cal had never met the man, but the description fit. Mid-50s, broad in the chest, sitting his horse with the ease of someone accustomed to covering ground quickly and leaving problems behind him. The 2 on either side were built like men hired specifically for situations where conversation hadn't worked. They passed without slowing. Cal waited until the sound died completely, then waited another 60 seconds beyond that. "Pruitt," Eleanor said. Her voice was absolutely flat. "He was the one in the middle." "I know." "He's going to the cabin." She was working it through, and she worked fast. "When they find it empty, they'll know we're running, and they'll know the only place worth running to is Jackson's Post. And Pruitt knows this territory." "Better than I'd like," Cal agreed. He took the lead line again. "Which means we don't take the road into town. We come in from the creek side, through the Alderman property." He started moving. "And we move faster." An hour and 20 minutes of hard going. Sargent was a good animal, steady, sure-footed, not given to panic. But carrying a 7-month pregnant woman over rough terrain in July heat asked something of all 3 of them. Eleanor didn't complain once. She swayed with a horse's gait and kept one hand on her stomach and her eyes on the tree line. And every time Cal glanced back at her, she looked like a woman doing exactly what needed doing and saving the feelings about it for later. 30 minutes in, she said, "The baby's moving more than usual." Cal's steps didn't break. "Is that bad?" "I don't know yet." A pause. "I'm keeping track." "Tell me if that changes." "I will." Another pause. "Keep moving." He kept moving. The creek came up on their left after another 40 minutes, cold and quick, and exactly where it was supposed to be. And following it downstream took them along the back edge of what had been the Alderman property before the family sold and moved to Colorado. Nobody had worked this land in 2 years. The fencing was down in places, the grass tall, and the old access road that ran behind it toward Jackson's Post was overgrown enough to be invisible from the main trail. Cal had used it twice before, both times for reasons that hadn't needed explaining to anyone. He got them onto that road, and they made better time. And it was on that road, with the rooftops of Jackson's Post just becoming visible through the tree line ahead, that they heard the shot. Not close, a quarter-mile behind them, maybe more. But it was a signal shot, the kind fired into the air, and both of them knew exactly what it meant. Pruitt had found the trail. "How far?" Eleanor's voice was tight. 10 minutes on foot, 5 if Sargent runs." "Then Sargent runs." She gathered the reins and looked down at him. "I can manage." "Eleanor, Cal." She cut him off cleanly. "I've ridden horses my whole life. I have a broken leg and not a broken spine. And Deke Pruitt is 10 minutes behind us. Let go of the lead line." He let go of the lead line. She moved Sargent into a canter, and Cal ran. Jackson's Post was not a large town, but it was a real one. A main street of a dozen buildings, a livery, a general store, a doctor's office, a saloon that doubled as a meeting hall, and a small hotel that Abel Crawford ran out of the same building as his courier service. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody's business, which was a disadvantage in most situations and an advantage in a few. Cal ran in from the creekside with his rifle and his saddlebag and found Eleanor already at the hitching post outside Crawford's, half dismounted and managing it with a controlled grimace that spoke to how much the ride had cost her. He was beside her before she reached the ground and got his arm under hers without asking. She accepted it without comment. "Crawford," Cal said. "Inside." She had caught her breath. "Already went in." Said the name Holt to the woman at the desk, and she went white and got him herself. Cal looked at her. "You move fast." "I told you I wasn't weak." He hadn't said she was, but he didn't say that either. He held the door, and they went inside. Abel Crawford was 60 years old, built like a fence post, and had the eyes of a man who had carried other people's urgent letters for 40 years and understood precisely how much was sometimes riding on the postal service. He looked at Cal when they came in, then at Eleanor, then at the state of them both, and he said nothing at all about any of it, except, "Sit down before you fall down, ma'am." Eleanor sat. "The letter," Cal said. "Already have it." Crawford held it up. It was still sealed. "Margaret at the desk said this young woman came in talking about Rufus Holt and a land deed, and I was already listening before she finished the sentence." He looked at Eleanor directly. "I'm riding at first light tomorrow. The letter will be in Cheyenne inside of 4 days. I know the man at the land office personally, and I'll put it in his hands myself." Eleanor's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. It was the first time since Cal had found her that he'd seen her body release anything. "Thank you," she said. "Mr. Crawford, I can't—" "Don't." He waved it off. "I've been watching Rufus Holt make himself into a problem for 20 years. It'll be my genuine pleasure." He set the letter in his coat. "Now, you two got a plan beyond getting that letter to me?" "Working on it," Cal said. Crawford looked at him. "Pruitt's in the territory." "We know. Half the men in this town are on Holt's payroll, or scared enough of him that it amounts to the same thing." Crawford said it without heat, just laying out the facts. "The other half are—" He paused, calculating. "Reasonable people who've been waiting for someone to give them a reason." "What kind of reason?" Cal asked. "The visible kind." Crawford leaned back in his chair. "The kind that happens in public, where there are witnesses, so that when it gets written down right." They didn't get to finish that conversation. The door opened behind Cal, and he turned with his hand on his rifle before he'd consciously decided to move, and the woman who came through it stopped short at the sight of him, her hands going up in pure reflex. She was young, maybe 25, with flour on her apron and the permanent squint of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. Her eyes went from Cal to Eleanor, and then something happened in her face that was not calculation and not sympathy, but something more specific. Recognition. "Mrs. Hart," her voice came out low and urgent. "I heard you were in town. My name is Josie Alderman. My father was Daniel Alderman." She came forward. "Holt burned our barn and broke my father's hand, and we left because my father couldn't fight anymore. But I—" She stopped. Her hands had come down, and now they were pressed flat against her thighs, and she was very still. "I know things. About the forged survey records, about what Holt filed with the county assessor the week after your husband died." She took a breath. "I kept copies." The room was absolutely silent. Eleanor looked at Josie Alderman for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Where are they?" "In my room upstairs. I've been carrying them for 8 months, waiting for someone who—" She stopped again. Her chin was steady, but her eyes were bright. "Waiting for someone who wasn't going to run." Eleanor's gaze moved to Cal. Cal was already looking at her. Then the window at the front of Crawford's building exploded inward in a shower of glass, and the world went loud and fast and entirely different from anything any of them had planned. Pruitt hadn't bothered with the road. He'd come in from the north side with 2 men. Not the blonde rider, not Greer. 2 different men, bigger, quieter. And they had not bothered with the kind of reasonable approach Greer had used at the cabin. Pruitt was done being reasonable. Cal could hear it in the way the man moved, the deliberate authority of someone who had decided that the performance of civility had outlived its usefulness. "Crawford!" Pruitt's voice came through the broken window without him showing his face. Experienced, careful. I'm looking for a woman, Mrs. Eleanor Hart. You hand her over, and we'll call the matter of your window settled between us." Crawford looked at his window. Then he looked at Cal with an expression that said he'd been waiting for something like this for 20 years and was not particularly surprised to find it happening in his own building. "You got a legal paper, Pruitt?" Crawford called back. "Got Rufus Holt's word, which is better." "Not in my building, it isn't." A pause. Then, "Cal Brennan, I know you're in there. You're a long way from your mountain, friend. This isn't your fight." Cal positioned himself to the side of the broken window, out of the direct line, rifle up. "You left a pregnant woman in a ravine with a broken leg," he said. "That made it my fight." "She fell. It was an accident. She's not well. Mentally, I mean. Grief does things to a person. We've all been worried about her." "That's interesting." Cal's voice was entirely conversational. "Because the woman I've been speaking with for the past day and a half seems to me to be one of the clearest thinkers I've ever met." Eleanor, from across the room, where Crawford had moved her against the interior wall, made a sound that, under other circumstances, might have been a short, startled laugh. She pressed her hand flat over her mouth. Josie Alderman was already at the stairs. Crawford had sent her up with one word and one look, and she had gone without hesitation. "Here's what's going to happen," Pruitt said. His voice had dropped the conversational warmth and was down to business now. "The woman comes out. Brennan keeps his life, and Crawford keeps his business, and everybody goes home. Holt's a fair man. He doesn't want anyone else getting hurt." "3 people in this room," Crawford said, "have personally experienced what Rufus Holt does to people he doesn't want to get hurt. So that particular argument is going to have limited effectiveness." Another pause, longer this time. Cal counted. 2 men he'd seen. Pruitt made 3. Were there more? Greer and the blonde rider hadn't come back into his line of sight since the trail. That was 4, minimum, if they were all still in play. The building had 1 front entrance, 1 back, and now 1 compromised window. Crawford knew his own building. That mattered. "Crawford," Cal said, low. "Back door opens onto the alley," Crawford said at the same volume. "Alley runs to the livery. Ed Marsh at the livery has had a bone to pick with Holt's people for 3 years. Hasn't asked me why not out loud, but hasn't looked the other way either." He paused. "And there are 12 other men in this town, right now, today, who've watched Holt take something from somebody they cared about. I've been counting." "What do they need?" Cal asked. "To see someone not back down." Crawford looked at him levelly. "That's all. Just someone not backing down in public, where they can see it." Cal thought about that for exactly 2 seconds. Then he did something that made Crawford's eyebrows rise, and Eleanor say his name in a sharp, low voice. He opened the front door and walked outside. Pruitt was standing 15 feet away, with his hand on his hip and 2 large men flanking him, and to his credit, he covered his surprise well. His expression didn't change by much, just a slight recalibration, the way a chess player looked when the other side made an unexpected move. "Brennan," he said. "Pruitt." Cal stood with his rifle at his side, not raised, not holstered, just present. "I'll make you an offer." "Is that right?" "Mrs. Hart has documentation, survey records, deed filings, county assessor receipts, all of it. Copies, so burning the originals won't help." He kept his voice flat and clear, not loud. Loud was for men who needed the volume to convince themselves. "She also has a letter already written and already in the hands of a courier, addressed to the land office in Cheyenne. That letter is going to Cheyenne regardless of what happens to her. Or to me." Pruitt's jaw moved, not much. "That's a brave story." "It's not a story, it's a fact. You can take Mrs. Hart back to Holt, and you can tell him that in 4 days there will be a federal inquiry into his land filings. And at that inquiry, there will be a woman who survived what your men did to her in that ravine. and there will be documents, and there will be witnesses. Cal held the man's eyes. Or, Pruitt repeated. Or, you ride back to Holt right now, and you tell him the land isn't worth what it's about to cost him. That Mrs. Hart's deed stands, and fighting it from here will pull more threads than he wants pulled. Cal didn't move, didn't blink. Because men like Holt don't build what he's built without a fair amount of thread they don't want pulled. Silence. The main street of Jackson's Post was very quiet. Cal was aware, without looking directly, of the two men who had drifted out of the general store doorway across the street. The man who had stopped walking and stood still on the boardwalk outside the saloon. The woman watching from the upper window of the hotel. The livery doors slightly open, and the shadow of a man standing just inside them. Crawford's 12. Pruitt saw it too. Cal watched him register each one, his eyes moving careful and fast. And he watched the calculation happening behind the foreman's face. The same calculation Greer had run at the cabin, but harder now, with more pieces on the board, and the math coming up different. You're protecting one woman, Pruitt said. One sick, grieving woman with nothing left. She has her land, Cal said. She has her child. She has a deed with her name on it and the truth of what your men did to her. And she's been carrying all of it alone for 4 months without bending. He paused. That's not nothing. The two men flanking Pruitt exchanged a glance. It was barely a glance, a flicker, gone in a second, but Cal caught it, and he was fairly certain Pruitt caught it too. Holt isn't going to let this go, Pruitt said, but the temperature in his voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. Holt can take it to the federal land office, Cal said, with his documentation against hers, in front of people who haven't been paid to look the other way. Another long silence. The sun was punishing. Nobody on the street moved. Then Pruitt did something Cal hadn't expected. He took a step back. Just one step, deliberate, not rushed. He looked at Cal for another long moment, and whatever he was looking for, he either found it or decided it didn't matter. This isn't finished, he said. That's up to Holt, Cal said. Pruitt turned his horse and rode north. His two men rode behind him. Neither of them looked back. Cal stood in the street and watched until they were gone. And then he stood there a moment longer because his legs had gone slightly unreliable, and he needed the extra second to lock them back into place before he turned around. Crawford was in the doorway. "Well," the old man said, after a moment, "that's the most interesting thing that's happened on this street in about 4 years." Cal walked back inside. Eleanor was standing, not sitting, standing, in the middle of the room, both hands over her stomach, her eyes on the door. When he came through it, she looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read, some combination of things he didn't have the language for, and she said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "You walked out that door." "Yes, ma'am." "Without your rifle raised?" "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him, the hand on her stomach pressed flat. "She's moving," she said quietly. "She kicked the moment you walked back in." Cal looked at Eleanor's hand over the round of her stomach, at the steadiness in her face and the brightness in her eyes that was not tears, had never been tears, was something harder and clearer than that. And for the first time in 6 years, he felt the particular ache of something thawing that had been frozen for a very long time. Josie Alderman came down the stairs behind them, with a leather case in both hands, and her jaw set like she'd been waiting 8 months for this exact moment, because she had. Crawford locked the front door, and outside, somewhere on the North Road, Deke Pruitt rode back to tell Rufus Holt that the situation had become more complicated than advertised. The day was not over. Everyone in that building knew it. But for the first time since Eleanor Hart had woken up bleeding at the bottom of a ravine, the numbers were different. Josie Alderman's leather case hit Crawford's table with a sound like a verdict being read. She unbuckled the strap with hands that were practiced and certain, the hands of someone who had opened this case in her mind 1,000 times before doing it in reality. And she laid the contents out with the kind of careful precision that said she had kept these documents organized through 8 months of moving and hiding and waiting. Survey maps, county assessor receipts, a folded letter on official stationery with a broken wax seal, 2 pages of handwritten figures that meant nothing to Cal at first glance, and everything to Eleanor, who leaned forward the moment they were on the table and didn't look up for a full 2 minutes. The room held its breath. Crawford stood with his arms crossed and read over Eleanor's shoulder. His expression didn't change much, but a muscle in his jaw worked steadily, which Cal had already learned was the man's equivalent of outrage. "This is the survey Holt filed in April," Eleanor said. She pressed her finger to a specific line on the top document. 3 weeks after Thomas died. Look at the boundary markers." She moved her finger. "This creek line. He moved it 40 yards west on paper. That puts the eastern boundary of our property inside what he's claiming as Holt Range." "Can they do that?" Cal asked. "Not legally," Josie said. "But my father's name is on the original survey from 1877. The one Holt filed supersedes it on county record because Sheriff Dannon's office accepted the filing without contest." She paused. "Because there was no one left to contest it. My father was already gone by then." "And now there is," Eleanor said. She looked up at Josie directly, and something passed between the two women. A recognition, woman to woman, of what it cost to carry a thing alone for as long as they both had. "You kept all of this." "My father told me to." Josie's chin came up slightly. "He said if Holt ever came for someone who could fight back, these would matter. He just didn't know how long it would take." Eleanor looked at the documents for another moment. Then she straightened and looked at Crawford. "How long before the land office in Cheyenne receives the letter?" 4 days to arrive. A week, maybe 10 days for them to assign someone to review it." Crawford pulled at his collar. "Which gives Holt a window." "How big a window?" Crawford and Cal looked at each other. The look said more than either of them said out loud. "Big enough," Cal said. Eleanor absorbed this. She didn't flinch, didn't panic, just recalculated the way she had been recalculating since the moment she woke up at the bottom of a ravine. "Then we need to narrow it," she said. "What does Holt do when he can't come at something directly?" "Comes at the people around it," Crawford said immediately. "He did it to the Aldermans, did it to 3 other families before that." He paused. "Anyone in this room is now a problem for him. Then nobody in this room should be easy to find." Eleanor looked at Josie. "You said you've been in Jackson's Post 8 months. Does Holt know you're here?" Josie hesitated. "I don't know. I've been careful. But Pruitt was just in town and—" "Then we move you tonight." Cal said it simply. "Crawford, you have room?" "I have a cellar that held 3 escaped slaves in 1861 and never got discovered," Crawford said. "It'll hold 1 stubborn young woman with a leather case." Josie looked briefly offended, and then more briefly grateful. "I don't need—" "Yes, you do," Eleanor said, not unkindly. "Those documents are the only copies. That means you and that case are the most important things in this building right now. So yes, you need." Josie closed her mouth, nodded once. It was settled. The afternoon wore on, and nobody came. That was almost worse than if they had, because the absence of Pruitt didn't mean Pruitt was gone. It meant he was somewhere else, doing something Cal couldn't see. And Cal Brennan was a man who dealt better with visible problems than invisible ones. He sat near the window with his rifle across his knees, and watched the street and thought about the particular patience of men like Holt, who had learned that waiting cost nothing, and that people under pressure had a way of making mistakes that did the work for you. Eleanor slept for 2 hours in the back room Crawford offered, and Cal knew she needed it, and kept watch, and didn't think about what her sleeping in the next room felt like, because that was not a thought that was useful to him right now. When she woke, she came out looking sharper than he'd expected, her hair pinned back neatly, her spine straight, the familiar look of controlled effort back in the set of her jaw. She accepted the plate of food Crawford's wife had sent over from the house next door, and ate with the methodical focus of a woman fueling an engine rather than enjoying a meal. "You should eat too," she said, without looking up. "I ate." "You didn't." She pushed the plate slightly toward the center of the table. "Watching the window burns more than you think." He ate. She was right, which he had no intention of telling her, although, from the brief flicker at the corner of her mouth, he suspected she knew it anyway. Crawford came in from the back with news from Ed Marsh at the livery. 2 of Holt's men had ridden in that afternoon and asked questions at the general store. Names, specifically Cal's name and Eleanor's name. The store owner, a man named Pitts, who owed Crawford 3 years of unpaid loans and had therefore chosen a side without being asked, had told them he hadn't seen anyone fitting either description. "Pitts is a good liar," Crawford said, with what sounded almost like affection. "How long can he keep it up?" Cal asked. "Holt will start offering money soon. Pitts is a good liar, but he's also a man with a mortgage." Crawford sat down heavily. "Tomorrow is the outer limit, I'd say. After that, the offer gets high enough that loyalty gets complicated." Eleanor set her fork down. "Then we need something to happen before tomorrow." "What kind of something?" Cal asked. She was quiet for a moment. He could almost see her thinking, the way you could see the current in a river, even when the surface looks still. "Holt needs to believe that fighting this is more expensive than settling it," she said. "Not just legally, publicly. He's built everything on the idea that nobody in this county has the standing to challenge him, and that any challenge will disappear quietly before it reaches anyone who matters." She looked up. "What if it didn't disappear quietly?" Crawford leaned forward slowly. "What are you thinking, Mrs. Hart?" he asked. "I'm thinking about the men you counted this morning," she said. "The 12. How many of them have a specific documented grievance against Holt? Not just resentment, a specific thing. Land taken, contract broken, family member hurt." Crawford thought about it. 7 off the top of my head, maybe 8. "And how many of them would sign a sworn statement to that effect if they knew they weren't signing alone?" Silence. Cal looked at Crawford. Crawford looked at Eleanor. And in the quiet that followed, something shifted in the room the way weather shifted. Not suddenly, but with a feeling that everything that came next was going to be different from everything that came before. "That," Crawford said slowly, "is either the best idea I've heard in 20 years, or the most dangerous." "It's both," Eleanor said. "Those things aren't mutually exclusive." Crawford stood up. "I'll start with Ed Marsh. He's got the most to say and the least left to lose." He picked up his hat. "You two stay inside." He was gone before Cal could answer. Eleanor and Cal were alone in the building for the first time since the cabin. It felt different here. Not better or worse. Different. The way the same 2 people felt different in different rooms. In the cabin, there had been the wilderness around them, and the particular kind of honesty that came from having nothing to distract from it. Here, there were walls and a town, and the reality of what came next pressing in from all sides. Cal sat across from her, and she looked at her hands, and then she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." "All right." When this is over, when the letter reaches Cheyenne and the inquiry happens and the deed is secured." She paused. "What do you do?" He looked at her steadily. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you came down off your mountain for me." She kept her eyes on him. "That's not something I take lightly. But I also know you didn't come down to stay down. I know that, because I know what it looks like when someone has built their whole life around the terms of their grief. And I have been watching you live inside yours for 2 days." A pause. "So I'm asking." The silence was long enough to be honest. "I don't know," he said finally. And it was the first time in 6 years he'd said those 3 words about anything to do with his own future, without the words meaning nothing. This time they meant something. They meant the question was real. "I stopped thinking about what came next a long time ago." "I know." Eleanor looked at him with that particular clear look that he'd come to understand was just who she was. She didn't soften things out of kindness. She told the truth out of it. "You should start." "Eleanor, I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. The quickness was the only sign that the conversation cost her something. "I want to be clear about that. You don't owe me a future just because you didn't keep walking." "I am not—" She stopped, took a breath. "I am aware that I am 7 months pregnant, and I have a broken leg, and a dead husband, and 2 dead children, and a land dispute with the most powerful man in the county, and I have no interest in any kind of pity." "That's not what this is," Cal said. She looked at him. "I haven't looked at you once with pity," he said. "Not when I found you in that ravine. Not when you told me about Daniel and Clara. Not now." He held her gaze. "What I look at you with is—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I don't have a clean word for it." "You don't need one," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "I don't reckon I do." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the street sounds of Jackson's Post moved around the building. Voices, a horse, the distant clang of the smithy. And inside, something that had been building since a ravine in the July heat settled into a shape that both of them recognized, and neither of them was ready to name out loud. Then Eleanor's breath changed. It was subtle, a slight deepening, a stillness that replaced her normal, measured quiet, her hand going flat against her stomach with a different kind of pressure than the protective reflex Cal had seen 100 times in the past 2 days. "Eleanor?" His voice was very even. "It's all right." But her jaw had tightened. "How long?" "On and off since we were riding. I didn't say anything because there was—" "Eleanor." He was already moving. "How far apart?" She paused. The look on her face was the look of a woman doing 2 things at once, managing real pain and making an assessment of it. "Not close yet. An hour, maybe more, between them. It could stop." She exhaled carefully. "It's early. 6 weeks early." "I know it's early." He was beside her now. "Crawford's wife, does she—" "I know," Crawford said from the doorway. Neither of them had heard him come back. He looked at Eleanor and said, without missing a beat, "My wife delivered 14 babies in this county before the doctor arrived in 1877. I'll get her." He was gone again. Eleanor looked at Cal. In her eyes, there was something raw and unguarded that he'd only glimpsed in pieces until now. Not fear exactly, but the specific terror of a woman who had already lost 2 children and was now 6 weeks early in a building in a town where armed men were looking for her, with Rufus Holt's money behind them. "She's going to be fine," Cal said. He said it with the same voice he'd used when he told her he would do everything in his power. Not a promise made lightly, but a statement of absolute intention. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he admitted. "But she has your constitution, and yours is the most formidable I've ever encountered." He put his hand over hers on the table. Not a gentle, tentative gesture. Firm. Present. "So I'm going with the odds." Eleanor looked at his hand over hers. Then she turned her hand over and held on. Martha Crawford was a small woman with enormous hands and the efficient calm of someone who had been the most competent person in the room in a crisis so many times it had become simply her normal state. She looked at Eleanor for 30 seconds and said, "First contraction since I walked in?" "4 minutes ago," Eleanor said. "And before that?" 40 minutes. Martha looked at Cal. "Get out," she said, pleasantly but absolutely. Cal got out. He stood in the main room of Crawford's building with his rifle and his saddlebag, and the sound of the town outside, and the sound of nothing very much inside, and he felt, for the first time in this whole thing, genuinely helpless. Which was different from being in danger. Danger he could work with. This was the other thing, the waiting thing, which was the hardest thing there was. Josie came up from the cellar. She looked at his face, and she looked at the door to the back room, and she put the leather case on the table and sat down and said, "Tell me what to do." "Nothing," Cal said. "Right now, there's nothing." She sat with him anyway. He appreciated it without saying so. An hour passed. Crawford came in at the 40-minute mark with news that Ed Marsh had signed. That was followed, over the next 20 minutes, by the news that 2 other men had signed. Then a fourth. Cal received each report and filed it away in the part of his mind that was running the legal problem, which was a smaller part than usual, because most of his mind was behind the closed door at the back of the building. Then the sound he'd been waiting for. Not the sound he feared, not silence or something wrong. A sound that started small and gathered itself and became something unmistakable. Something that cut through every other thought in his head and stopped him where he stood. A baby crying. Not the thin, uncertain cry of something struggling. A strong cry, indignant and immediate and entirely convinced of its own right to be heard. Cal sat down in Crawford's chair because his legs made the decision for him. Josie pressed both hands over her mouth. Crawford, who had been standing in the doorway, turned away and faced the wall, and spent a moment on that before he trusted himself to turn back around. The door opened, and Martha Crawford came out, wiping her hands on a cloth, her face composed in the specific, careful way that could mean anything. And Cal stood back up immediately. "The mother," he said. "Is fine," Martha said. "Tired and stubborn as anything, which, in my experience, is the ideal combination." She looked at him with eyes that had seen enough of the world to read a man's face accurately. "You can go in." He went in. Eleanor was sitting up against the wall with a bundle of cloth in her arms, and she looked exhausted in a way that went all the way down to the bone. And she looked more alive than Cal had seen her look yet. And when he came through the door, she looked up at him, and the expression on her face was something he knew he was going to carry for the rest of his life, regardless of what happened next. "Come here," she said. He came. She turned the bundle slightly so he could see. The baby was very small and very red, and had Eleanor's stubborn jawline already, which under other circumstances might have been funny. And she was sleeping now, after apparently making her position on the matter quite clear. "Hope," Eleanor said quietly. "Her name is Hope." Cal looked at the child for a long moment. Something moved in his chest that he had no defense against, and didn't try to build one. "That's a good name," he said. "Thomas chose it." Her voice was soft. He said whatever came next, That was what we'd call it. Hope. She adjusted the cloth around the baby's face with a care so precise and natural it looked like breathing. He was right. Cal pulled the chair close and sat beside her. And he didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would have been better than the silence. And Eleanor leaned her head back against the wall and let her eyes close for a moment. And Hope slept between them with the total unconscious confidence of someone who had arrived into the world and expected to be looked after. 3 minutes passed, maybe 5. Then Crawford knocked twice and opened the door a crack, and the look on his face was not the look of a man bringing good news. "We've got a problem," he said. Cal straightened. Beside him, Eleanor opened her eyes. "Holt's in town," Crawford said. "Not Pruitt, not hired men. Rufus Holt himself." A pause. "He's at the sheriff's office, and he's got a paper signed by a circuit judge in Laramie, declaring Eleanor Hart mentally unfit to manage her own affairs, citing grief and instability." He paused again. "The paper gives him temporary custodial management of the Hart property, pending a formal review." The room was very quiet. "A circuit judge," Cal said. "Bought one," Crawford said simply. "Or called in a favor from one. With Holt, it's usually both." Eleanor had not moved. She held Hope against her chest, and she looked at the wall in front of her, and her jaw was set in a line that Cal recognized as the line she wore when she was deciding something. "How long does the paper hold?" she asked. "Until the review. 4, 6 weeks?" Crawford looked at Cal. "Which is after our letter reaches Cheyenne, but before any federal inquiry could realistically convene. Which means he doesn't need to hurt anyone," Cal said slowly. "He just needs to get Eleanor in front of a friendly judge before the federal inquiry makes the local ruling irrelevant. That's the shape of it." Eleanor looked down at Hope. Then she looked up. "Then we don't let him get me in front of any judge," she said. "Not here. Not one of his." She looked at Cal with a clarity that had nothing of defeat in it. "How far is Cheyenne?" Cal and Crawford both looked at her. 3 days hard ride, Cal said carefully. "Can I travel?" Eleanor, "Martha already said yes," she said. "I asked her before you came in. She said not ideal and not her recommendation, and yes, physically possible, if the baby stays stable." She held his gaze. "So, can I travel?" Cal looked at this woman who had survived a ravine and a broken leg and 6 weeks premature and Rufus Holt's hired men, and was now, less than 2 hours after giving birth, looking at him with eyes that were exhausted and unbreakable in equal measure. "With the right horse," he said slowly, "and the right pace." "And the right company," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up and picked up his rifle. "Crawford," he said, "we're going to need horses." And in the other room, Josie Alderman picked up her leather case and said, from behind the door, "I'm coming too." Crawford moved fast for a man his age. He had 3 horses saddled and provisioned inside 40 minutes, which Cal suspected had less to do with speed and more to do with the fact that Crawford had been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of departure for longer than anyone knew. The man handed Cal a canvas pack without being asked and said, "Food, medicine, clean cloth for the baby. Ed Marsh is going to make a great deal of noise at the north end of town in about 20 minutes. Enough noise that anyone watching the livery is going to be watching the north end instead." "What kind of noise?" Cal asked. "Ed Marsh has a very loud argument with his brother-in-law every 6 weeks or so." Crawford's expression was entirely neutral. "Tonight seems like a reasonable time for another one." Cal gripped the man's hand. Crawford gripped back. "You get that woman to Cheyenne," Crawford said. Everything else I can manage here. The signed statements. 7 men now. I'll have 10 before morning, and I'll keep them safe. He paused. Holt doesn't know about Josie. He doesn't know about the copies. He came here thinking a piece of paper from a bought judge was going to end this quietly. Crawford picked up his hat. Let's make sure he finds out how wrong he was. Cal went back inside. Eleanor was on her feet. Martha had fashioned a sling from cotton cloth that held Hope tight against Eleanor's chest, close and secured, the baby's head tucked just under her mother's chin. It was practical, and it was clearly Martha's solution, and Eleanor had accepted it with the wordless efficiency of a woman who was going to manage this, because there was no alternative to managing it. She looked at Cal when he came in. Ready? Josie's already at the horses. Then let's go. Martha caught Eleanor's arm gently as she moved toward the door. The two women looked at each other for a moment. Martha said, low, You feel anything wrong, you stop. I don't care what's behind you. I know, Eleanor said. I mean it. Martha. Eleanor put her hand briefly over the older woman's. I know. Thank you. They went out the back. The night was warm and moonlit, and entirely indifferent to their situation, which was, Cal had found, the general disposition of Wyoming in summer. He helped Eleanor mount, with one hand under her arm and one steadying Hope through the sling, and she settled into the saddle with a controlled exhale and adjusted the baby and nodded once. No complaint. No hesitation. Josie was already up, the leather case strapped across her back, her jaw set in a line that reminded Cal unexpectedly of Eleanor herself. Younger, less worn, but made of the same material. From the north end of town, the sound of 2 men shouting at each other about a fence line rose into the night air at considerable volume. At least 2 other voices had apparently gotten involved in Ed Marsh's domestic dispute, which was either improvisation or a testament to the kind of loyalty Crawford had quietly been building for years. Cal took the south road out of Jackson's Post at a pace that was fast enough to mean business and slow enough to keep Eleanor and the baby from being shaken apart. He rode behind them, watching the dark for movement, and the first mile passed without incident, and then the second, and by the 3rd mile, the lights of Jackson's Post had disappeared behind them, and there was nothing ahead but the road and the Wyoming night, and 3 days to Cheyenne. Hope made a small sound against Eleanor's chest. Eleanor's hand came up automatically and pressed the baby closer. She's all right, Eleanor said, without being asked. Just adjusting. You tell me if anything changes. I will. A pause. Cal? Yeah? Thank you for not arguing with me about this. Would it have done any good? She almost laughed. Not quite, because laughing on horseback with a newborn required a level of confidence she wasn't quite at yet. But it was close. No, she said. It would not. They rode on. They stopped twice in the first night, once to water the horses and once because Eleanor needed to feed Hope, which she did with a matter-of-fact briskness that had Josie turning politely away and Cal doing the same, and both of them listening to the night with their hands on their weapons, while Eleanor conducted the most ordinary and necessary business in the world behind them. It was during the second stop that Josie said quietly to Cal, How far behind do you think they are? Holt went to the sheriff's office first, Cal said. He'll want that paper served officially before he sends anyone after us, because he needs this to look legal. That buys us time. He watched the road behind them. But Pruitt won't wait on paperwork. Pruitt will come when Pruitt's ready. And when's that? When he figures out we're not in Jackson's Post anymore. Cal paused. Morning, maybe. First light. Josie absorbed this with a kind of steadiness that impressed him. She'd been through enough that fear didn't knock her sideways anymore. It just became another thing to account for. Then we need to be well past the county line by morning. That's the plan. Is there a faster route? There's a route that's faster and harder, Cal said. Cuts 2 hours, but it goes through Ridgeback Pass, which is narrow and dark, and not a place I'd take a woman 2 hours postpartum in the middle of the night. Eleanor might disagree with that assessment, Josie said. Eleanor disagrees with most of my assessments, Cal said. That doesn't always make her wrong. Behind them, Eleanor's voice came dry and clear. I can hear you both. Cal turned. She was putting Hope back in the sling with that same precise automatic tenderness, not looking up, but the line of her mouth had the particular quality of a woman who was listening, even when she appeared not to be. Ridgeback Pass, she said. Eleanor, how much time does it save? He looked at her. She looked back. 2 hours, he said. Then we take it. She settled Hope against her chest and picked up her reins. 2 hours is 2 hours. Josie looked at Cal. Cal looked at the road. Then he turned his horse and led them toward Ridgeback Pass, because Eleanor Hart had made a decision, and the only productive response to that was to make sure it didn't kill them. The pass was narrow, and the footing was uneven, and the dark was the kind that required Cal to navigate more by memory than sight, which he could do, had done, but which required a level of focused attention that left no room for conversation. He moved them through it in silence, step by careful step, with Josie close behind Eleanor, and Eleanor holding Hope with one arm and her reins with the other, and not making a single sound that wasn't absolutely necessary. They came out the other side, with the sky beginning to lighten in the east. Cal pulled up and looked back at the pass, and then at Eleanor. How are you doing? Don't ask me that right now, she said evenly. That bad? I said don't ask. But there was no heat in it, just a woman running on reserves she was managing carefully, and the part of her that permitted honesty was being rationed for things that mattered. I'm moving. Let's keep moving. They kept moving. By the time full dawn came up, they were past the county line. Cal felt the moment they crossed it less as a geographic fact and more as a shift in breathing. His own, and he suspected Josie's. Eleanor's breathing hadn't changed, which meant either she hadn't noticed or she was past the point where county lines felt like safety. Probably the second one. They stopped at a creek to water the horses and eat what Crawford had packed. And it was during that stop, with Hope sleeping in her sling and the horses drinking, and Josie eating dried biscuit, with the focused determination of someone replacing fuel, that Cal heard it. Horses. Behind them. More than one. He was on his feet before either woman registered the sound. How far? Eleanor asked immediately. 10 minutes, maybe 15. He was scanning the road behind them. More than 2. Josie stood up and put her hand on the leather case strapped to her back, with a gesture so instinctive it was practically unconscious. Pruitt, Eleanor said. It wasn't the question. Most likely. Cal's mind was moving fast. They couldn't outrun riders on an open road with the horses they had. His was the strongest animal of the three, and even his wouldn't sustain a hard run for long, carrying a man Cal's size over this terrain. Running was not the answer. There's a way station 2 miles ahead, Willard's. Stage line stops there twice a week. And, Eleanor said, stage comes through this morning, eastbound. He looked at her. Cheyenne's a stage stop. Eleanor understood immediately. If we're on that stage, harder to run off a stage than 3 riders on an empty road, Cal said. More witnesses. And Willard's been a stage line operator for 20 years. He doesn't tolerate interference with his route. He has the federal contract. Federal, Josie said, and the word landed with the weight it deserved. Let's ride, Eleanor said. They made Willard's in under 15 minutes, which asked the last of what the horses had, and Cal was off his animal before it stopped moving, already talking to the broad man who came out of the way station door with a frown that smoothed into something more careful when Cal said Crawford's name, and then Cheyenne, and then Federal Land Inquiry in the same sentence. Willard looked at Eleanor on her horse, at the sling, at the baby, at the set of Eleanor's face, at the splinted leg. And then he looked at Cal with the expression of a man who was deciding quickly. "Stage comes in 40 minutes, he said. "We need 3 seats. "Stage is full. "Then we need 3 of those seats to become available." Willard looked at him for another long moment. Then he looked back at Eleanor. Something moved in his face. Recognition, maybe, or just the particular human response to seeing a woman holding a newborn on a horse on a hard road and understanding, without needing the details, that the situation was serious. "I'll see what I can do," he said. He went inside. Cal turned back to help Eleanor down and found she was already off the horse, managing it without him, though the effort showed in the color of her face and the very careful way she was holding herself together. "Inside," he said, not a question. "Inside," she agreed. They were barely through the door when the sound of horses outside multiplied, and Cal turned and looked through the window and counted 4 riders pulling up to the way station, with the particular purposeful canter of men who had been riding hard and knew they'd found what they were looking for. Pruitt was not among them. The man in front was someone Cal hadn't seen before. Older, gray-suited, with the bearing of someone who worked in offices and courts rather than fields and saddles. He had a paper in his hand. Eleanor had followed Cal's gaze. She stood at his shoulder and looked at the man outside and said very quietly, "That's not a hired man." "No," Cal said. "That's a lawyer." Her voice was even. "Holt's lawyer. His name is Garrett Pierce. I've seen him before." A pause. "He's the one who drew up the papers Thomas refused to sign." Garrett Pierce dismounted with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed the paperwork in his hand constituted a conclusion rather than an opening. Willard met him at the door. Cal listened to the conversation without moving from Eleanor's side. Pierce presented the judge's paper, the mental incompetency ruling, and explained that he was empowered to take Mrs. Hart into protective custody for her own welfare and return her to the county where the matter would be properly adjudicated. Willard read the paper. His expression didn't change. "This is a county court document," he said. "Signed by a circuit judge," Pierce said smoothly, "which gives it broad jurisdiction." "This is a federal stage stop," Willard said, "on a federal postal route, under federal contract." He handed the paper back. "Whatever that document says, you don't have authority to detain anyone on this property." Pierce's smooth expression developed a small crack. "Mr. Willard, I don't think you understand the nature of—" "I've been running stage lines for 20 years, Willard said pleasantly. "I understand federal jurisdiction better than most lawyers I've met, present company included." He folded his hands. "The stage arrives in 32 minutes. Any passengers waiting here are under the protection of the federal postal route until they board. After they board, they're under postal authority until they reach their destination." He tilted his head. "You want to take that up with the Postal Service, Mr. Pierce? You're welcome to write them a letter. They'll get back to you eventually." Pierce stared at him. Then he looked past Willard, directly through the window, and his gaze found Eleanor standing inside with hope in her arms and a look on her face that was not triumph. Triumph was too small a word, but something larger and quieter. The look of a woman watching the first real wall hold. Pierce turned back to his men. Low voices, quick calculations. Cal's hand was on his rifle. Then Pierce did something unexpected. He straightened his jacket and looked at Willard with a new expression, cooler, more careful. "We'll wait," he said, "for the stage, to ensure Mrs. Hart boards safely." Translation: he was going to wire Cheyenne and have someone waiting at the other end. Cal stepped outside. Pierce looked at him with professional assessment. "Mr. Brennan, you've involved yourself considerably in a matter that doesn't concern you." "It concerned me from the bottom of a ravine," Cal said, "and I reckon it'll keep concerning me until Eleanor Hart is standing in the Cheyenne land office with her deed in her hand and Josie Alderman's documents on the table." He held the man's gaze. "After that, you and Holt can spend whatever you'd like on however many lawyers you want. But that deed stands, and those documents exist, and there are 7 sworn statements in Crawford's safe that are going to become 10 before this week is out." He paused. "Tell Holt the math doesn't work anymore." Something moved in Pierce's eyes. Not fear. Men like Pierce didn't fear the way ordinary people feared. But calculation. Rapid, genuine calculation. The kind that happened when the numbers actually changed. "Holt doesn't accept losses," Pierce said. "Then Holt's going to lose more than he planned on," Cal said, "because the woman inside that building has been managing impossible math for 4 months, and she hasn't been wrong once yet." Pierce looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned, said something quiet to one of his men, and walked to his horse. He didn't mount immediately. He stood with his hand on the saddle and his back to Cal, and Cal watched him think. And then Pierce mounted, and the 4 of them rode east at a controlled pace that was neither retreat nor attack, but something in between that Cal recognized as the gait of men buying time. He stood in the sun and watched them go, and kept watching until they were out of sight. Then he went back inside. Josie had the leather case open on Willard's table and was organizing the documents in the order they'd need to be presented, her handwriting neat and quick on the summary sheet she was drafting. Willard was watching her with the expression of a man who had formed a rapid and favorable opinion. Eleanor was sitting in the chair nearest the window, Hope awake now, and looking at the world with the unfocused, intent concentration of a newborn, deciding what to think of it. Eleanor was looking at Cal when he came through the door, and the look was the one he'd come to know best, clear and direct and containing more things than it said out loud. "He's going to wire Cheyenne," she said. "Yes." "We'll have company on the other end." "Yes." She considered this. "How far does the Federal Postal Authority actually extend?" "To the land office and back," Cal said. "If we go straight there from the stage." "Then we go straight there." She looked at Hope. The baby had found Eleanor's finger and was holding on with the absolute conviction of someone who had just arrived and already understood what mattered. "We don't stop. We don't check into a hotel. We walk off that stage and we go directly to the land office and we put Josie's documents on the desk of whoever is on duty, and we do not leave until someone official has looked at them and written something down." "That's the plan," Cal agreed. "Good." She adjusted Hope in the sling. "Because I'm not doing this twice." There was something in the way she said it. Not just exhaustion, though there was plenty of that, but a finality that was about more than the land dispute. About the last 4 months. About the last 2 years. About everything she'd been carrying since Daniel and Clara and Thomas, and the long road from a grief-flattened life to a morning in a way station on the wrong side of a county line with a newborn and a broken leg and a case full of evidence, and a man she'd known for 3 days who had become, without either of them planning it, the most reliable thing in her world. She looked at Cal. He looked back. "When this is done," she said. "When this is done," he agreed. It was not a complete sentence, but it was a promise, the way promises sometimes worked between people who had already said the important things in the silences, and didn't need the words to make them real. The stage came in loud and on time. They boarded in the order Cal had decided. Josie first with the case, then Eleanor with Hope, then Cal last, settling into the seat nearest the door, with his rifle across his knees and his eyes on the road outside the window. The driver cracked his whip, and the horses lurched forward, and Jackson's Post and Ridgeback Pass, and the cabin in the spruce, and the ravine where a woman had been left for dead, fell behind them mile by mile. And ahead, 3 days east, Cheyenne waited. Hope slept for the first hour with the same untroubled confidence she'd shown since her first indignant cry in Crawford's back room. Eleanor slept too, finally, deeply, her head tipped back against the stage wall, one hand over the baby, even in unconsciousness. Josie watched out the window with her hand on the leather case and didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, quietly, not to anyone in particular, "My father would have liked this." "Liked what?" Cal asked. "This." She gestured slightly. The stage, the road ahead, the sleeping woman and her baby, all of it. Someone not backing down. Cal looked at Eleanor sleeping across from him, at Hope's small fist curled against her mother's collarbone, at the broken down, piece by piece, holding on with everything evidence of a woman who had been hit by every kind of loss there was, and had looked at each one and decided every single time that it was not sufficient reason to stop. "No," he said quietly. "She never did back down." 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning in late July, Eleanor Hart walked into the Cheyenne Federal Land Office on a splinted leg, with her baby in a sling, and Josie Alderman beside her, and a mountain man holding the door, and she put Thomas Hart's original deed and Josie Alderman's survey copies and a stack of sworn statements from 7 men in Jackson's Post down on the desk of a federal land agent named Morrison, who had not been paid by Rufus Holt and had not been warned they were coming. Morrison read for 40 minutes without looking up. Pierce's man had been waiting outside the stage stop. He'd followed them to the land office and stood in the doorway for 10 minutes before Morrison looked up from the documents, looked at the man in the doorway, and said, with the particular flat authority of a federal employee who had been doing this job for 15 years and was not impressed, "This is a federal office. You're either a party to this inquiry or you're not in this room." The man left. Morrison read for another 20 minutes. Then he looked up at Eleanor. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "I'm going to need you to leave these with me for review. That review will take approximately 1 week." "And during that week?" Eleanor asked. "During that week, the county filing that was superseding your deed is suspended pending inquiry." He looked at her steadily, "Which means no actions can legally be taken against the Hart property or its title holder." A pause. "That includes the mental competency ruling from your county court, which I would note appears to have some procedural irregularities that we'll be looking at carefully." Eleanor held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "How long before it's resolved?" "Completely? 2 months, maybe 3. Land disputes move at their own pace." He paused, and there was something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. The look of a man who had seen enough fraudulent filings to recognize real documentation when he held it, and who took a certain professional satisfaction in the distinction. "But the outcome, Mrs. Hart, based on what you've put on this desk today, is not particularly in doubt." The room was very quiet. Eleanor looked down at Hope, asleep against her chest, entirely unaware of the conversation that had just secured the ground beneath her future. Then she looked back up at Morrison. "Thank you," she said. And then she turned, and she looked at Cal, and there was no performance in her face and no ceremony. Just Eleanor Hart, clear-eyed and bone-tired and still standing, looking at the man who had not kept walking on a July morning above a ravine in Wyoming. And that was enough. That was everything. Cal held the land office door open for her, and she walked through it, into the Cheyenne sun, with Hope Hart in her arms, and the land was hers, and the child was safe, and the long, terrible season of surviving alone was finally, irrevocably, over. Some things, once begun, don't need explaining. They just need someone willing to take the first step down into the ravine, and someone strong enough to climb back out. Those two had both.